I thought we might start with just a little something that might kind of put us in the mood and at the same time help me to begin to make a point. So I just put up a comic and I will audio describe it. So it is a scene outside of a building, and there's a lot of snow on the ground. And there's lots of people standing around waiting. There is one individual who is shoveling steps. One of the people who's waiting uses a wheelchair and says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the person who's shoveling says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And then the person who's using the wheelchair says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." So I thought that might be kind of a good place to start. One of the things that I'm going to talk about a lot today is universal accessibility. Let me back up and say that what Portlight is doing and the opportunity that we all have to work together to the benefit of our whole community across the country is really quite notable, and really what it's going to take to help communities across this country to adequately prepare for the next big thing, or small thing or medium thing, because this is all about all hazards and the reality that in every community in this country, stuff happens every day. And we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough experts, we don't have enough people who have a full-time responsibility for this stuff, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough time, et cetera, et cetera. And if we don't do a better job of engaging the whole community, we're all going to fail. So the work that Portlight is doing, Portlight has taken a very strong stand in a very tough space and has really moved from what was kind of a fledgling effort a couple of years ago to start sort of carrying a message, and has really become the preeminent community leader across the country on disability inclusive emergency management, whole community emergency management in that whole community sense. So I'll talk some more about that as we go. I do want to also give a shout out to Holly Culture, who is with Paul at Portlight, and I'm also very excited to say that she is a new FEMA reservist and just onboarded as a FEMA reservist last week, a few days ago. We'll start her training next week if we're still open and operating, but that's another topic for another hour. And then in the room, we have a number of other FEMA team members, and I'd love them to all signal for you all that they're in the room. We have disability integration advisors from our incident management assistance team. We have disability integration specialists from two of our regions, Region 3 and Region 4. We have, and Craig, you already identified, but I'm going to shout you out again. We have someone who is with our individual with our recovery team from Region 3. So we have a wonderful spread of folks who are frontline first responders from FEMA. And then in addition to that, we have folks who do a lot of our steady state work. Anybody else from FEMA in the room that I'm not giving that appropriate shout out to? Okay, just wanted to make sure that I wasn't overlooking anybody. So I'm going to be mindful of the time. I was asked to shorten up what I have to say, so I may buzz through some of this stuff a little more quickly than I would otherwise. For those of you who don't know what FEMA's mission is, and I know there's a lot of confusion around it, I will start by very specifically telling you that FEMA's mission is to support our citizens and first responders to ensure that as a nation we work together to build, sustain, and improve our capability to prepare for, protect against, respond to, recover from, and mitigate all hazards. And when we talk about FEMA assistance, and at the moment, Mike Houston, who's with our incident management assistance team and is in the room, is being highlighted on a photograph that I'm showing. When we talk about FEMA assistance, there's a misperception that, for example, bad snowstorm, FEMA's in the house, so therefore FEMA's in charge, right? No, wrong. The only time that FEMA steps in, and our reason for being, is to support states at their request. Oh, and I forgot Dawn Brantley, who's another of our reservists who didn't signal over there. Dawn is another of our reservists. So FEMA's role is in support of our states at their request. We provide a variety of services before, during, after, and in mitigation for disasters, but only when the states request that of us. When there's a disaster, and that disaster is declared by the president, found to be eligible for the services that the federal government can bring to a state, it's at that point that FEMA resources become available to those states. So many times people will say, well, why hasn't FEMA gotten here yet? Why isn't FEMA taking care of this? Why isn't FEMA doing anything about this? Well, when the state asks us for assistance, that's when we get involved. For a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is that there is a cost share. When FEMA is providing assistance, states do pay for some of those resources and do pay a share of those resources. I will give an opportunity for questions and answers as we move on. But I'm going to, again, as I said earlier, I'm going to move a little more quickly, so I'm not going to deep dive into how the FEMA assistance processes work. They're complex, and there are many of them, and I'm happy to answer questions later on. So I came to FEMA just about 6 years ago, and came on board as a result of the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act obligation for FEMA to have a disability coordinator who reports directly to the administrator. And about 5 years ago, we stood up the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination, and our mission is to lead FEMA's commitment to achieving whole community emergency management inclusive of individuals with disabilities and others with access and functional needs by providing guidance, tools, methods, and strategies to establish equal physical, program, and effective communication access. So our job is not to handle disability issues, but rather to bake into what everybody else is doing. And we have a motto, baking it in, not layering it on. We don't want to be the special sauce. We want to be very much integrated, very much included in the ingredients every step of the way. And that's how effective disability inclusion happens. We have a cadre, and I pointed out two of our reservists, Dawn and Holly, and several of our team members. who are full-time folks. We have a cadre of about 75 people at this point. That cadre is growing. Among our cadre, we have 30 people who are full-time disability integration advisors, 25 who are reservists. Among our reservists, we also have 20 sign language interpreters, 5 certified deaf interpreters, and then we also bring on board a number of other folks, both from local communities and from our federal partners as needed in disasters. There are a number of federal laws. We often talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, but there are actually a number of federal laws that prohibit discrimination in emergency programs on the basis of disability. And for the federal government, in fact, it's the Rehabilitation Act that applies most specifically to what we do. But many of the other laws that I've listed, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Stafford Act, the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, Fair Housing Act amendments, Architectural Barriers Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Telecommunications Act, 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, and others all pretty seamlessly work together to provide a seamless responsibility to provide equal access, physical access, program access, and effective communication access for people with disabilities. And the Americans with Disabilities Act, as most of you know, doesn't just prohibit discrimination in emergency programs, but very much across the board in terms of employment, government, accommodations, et cetera. But there is a specific protected group of people. And that protected class doesn't just include people who have a disability. It also includes people who may have a record of disability, so a student who was receiving special education services in school still maintains the protections as a person who has that record, even if they're no longer receiving special education services beyond school, and people who are regarded as having a disability. So, for example, somebody who has a facial difference who may be discriminated against in a restaurant because of how they look, because there is a perception that that individual has a disability, that person has those same protections. And so I share all of this because I want you to be thinking in terms of the emergency context and who we're talking about when we talk about those protections. Doesn't apply to people who have short-term disability, people who have short-term, what would be considered, limitations, access and functional needs, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So if I sprain my ankle, I may have the same access and functional needs as a person with a disability, but I don't have those same legal protections. Disability covers major life activities, and there's a wide range of what is included in major life activities, some of which is obvious, some of which is not necessarily quite as obvious when people are thinking about who is covered. It not only includes major life activities, but bodily functions, and there's a long list of bodily functions that are also eligible for those legal protections. And I'm sort of teeing this up for a couple of reasons. One is because the U.S. Census identifies that about 18.7% of people who live in the community have a disability. There's also 2 million people who live in hospitals and institutions across this country who aren't even counted by the census. And so while you will often see that there are 57 million people with disabilities, in fact, I am very persistent in saying that there are 59 million people with disabilities because we don't even count those 2 million people. 100% of them who are living in hospitals and institutions are, in fact, people with disabilities. This doesn't include the other 2 million people who are in correctional facilities or other non-disability related institutional settings. So 20% of the US population, globally 1 billion people, and among those of us who are data junkies, and I would be one of them, this severely underestimates the numbers. And I know this because, for example, Johns Hopkins recently published data, and I would call Hopkins a pretty reliable data source. And Hopkins just recently published data that clearly indicate that 48 million Americans are deaf or hard of hearing. So if we're talking about 59 Americans with disabilities, 48 million of them are people who are deaf or hard of hearing. There's probably more than 59 million people, just saying. We could spend a lot of time sort of debating what those numbers are, but here's the sort of salient point in all of this, and I've just put up a slide. This is one of my favorites. This is the New Madrid seismic zone percentage of people with disabilities. The New Madrid zone is the area in the middle of the country. 8 states are directly included in the New Madrid seismic zone. These are states that could, excuse me, could potentially experience the impact of catastrophic earthquake from this particular fault, the New Madrid fault. We talk about California a lot, and you know, the big one out in California, we not too long ago had one here in Virginia that impacted DC, which our California friends had a great time teasing us about. But the reality is that there are lots of places in this country that have the potential for catastrophic, no-notice events. And so I put up this slide of the New Madrid seismic zone for a specific reason. Because on this map, you will notice that those 8 states are broken into counties, and then colors are used to describe the percentage of people with disabilities in each of those counties. And you'll notice that many of those counties are in green, and so the percentage of people with disabilities in those counties is somewhere between 12 or 13% and 21%. So, you know, pretty solidly in that description I used earlier of that, you know, 18 to 20% population. But it's the smallest number in those counties, in those 8 states around the New Madrid seismic zone that needs to be preparing for a catastrophic disaster with no notice. The next group are the yellow, of which there are quite a few of those counties that have a population somewhere between 20% and almost 26% people with disabilities. And then you'll also notice that there's a huge number of counties that are in red, and those counties identify the percentage of people with disabilities as being somewhere between almost 26% and as much as almost 33%. So we're suddenly talking about 1 in 3 people in a pretty large swath of states that we anticipate have the potential for catastrophic disaster. So if we're planning for what we think is that 18.2% or 20%, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 people, and we're not taking those local demographics into consideration, we're not planning for real. We're planning for some sort of hypothetical. And so among the many lessons that we are learning, one is you got to plan for where you live. You got to plan. All disasters are local, so you got to be thinking about who's in your community and what it's going to take in your community rather than some sort of hypothetical number. Another example, in southern Louisiana, there's a large population of people who have a genetic family history of something called Usher syndrome, which results in significant hearing loss and vision loss. And so many people are both deaf and blind. Well, the numbers across the country are so minuscule of people who are deaf and blind, most communities are not going to make a point of planning inclusive of people who may require a lot of thinking in terms of alerts and warnings. But in southern Louisiana, if they're taking those specific numbers, their demographics into consideration, there are many people living out in the community for whom your standard alerts and warnings are not going to be effective. And information has to be accessible to be effective. So we have a large population of people who either aren't getting information or aren't able to act on that information. Then you're going to have disproportionate impact on those individuals and all of the people in that community. A lot of people are going to end up in your hospitals or your acute care settings. A lot of people are going to end up needing the limited first responder support that is limited on a sunny day and becomes even more taxed during a disaster. So, know your community. I want to take a moment and talk about the Rehabilitation Act because most particularly, the Rehabilitation Act applies to every federal dollar. Physical access, program access, effective communication access applies to every federal dollar. It not only applies to what FEMA spends, but it also applies to every grant dollar, every grantee dollar. And so there is no sort of, it's somebody else's responsibility to meet physical program and effective communication access when it comes to the use of federal dollars. So this applies across the board in any preparedness activities that are using federal dollars. Physical access, program access, effective communication access. So in any of your preparedness, if you're not making those materials available in alternate formats, then not everybody has equal access to that information. If when you're doing your training and your exercises, you're focusing on how to include people with disabilities so that they have equal opportunity to participate, so they can use the public transportation system at 5 o'clock in the morning to get to where the exercise is happening so that they really can participate, so that we're using those resources to really, truly exercise our capabilities. Whether it's in our shelters, if people show up at your shelter and want to be sheltered in that shelter, physical, program, effective communication access is something to plan for. We understand that in the exigent circumstances of a disaster, the best plans may make it difficult to get that sign language interpreter there, or may make it difficult to, the ramp that was there yesterday may have been washed away, or, there's any number of circumstances that you then have to, think on the spot and provide alternates. But it's when we fail to plan inclusive of the whole community that things get more complicated. Not just for those individuals, but it gets more complicated for the whole community, because then we're using disproportionate resources, and our community is going to have a disproportionate impact simply because we haven't planned for how we're going to accommodate everybody. So, Rehabilitation Act, every federal dollar, from planning all the way to getting everybody back home again, and then planning for the next inevitable thing that happens. So you hear us talking a lot about disability and then access and functional needs. And I know it gets confusing. I had a conversation with some folks yesterday. So is disability an okay word to use? Are we using access and functional needs instead of disability? Are we, what is going on here? And I think there's a lot of confusion around all of this. So remember I said there are 59 million people with disabilities. We think it's probably higher, but whatever. We'll go with 59 million people. But there's lots of other people. Remember I said that person who has the sprained ankle doesn't have those legal protections? But if they show up at your shelter, or if they need to evacuate, does it matter whether they acquired their disability 5 minutes ago, 5 days ago, 5 years ago? Doesn't matter, because we still have to support them to get the heck out of Dodge. Otherwise, they're going to end up in your emergency room. They're going to end up needing a disproportionate amount of support from your first responders. Or horrible things are going to happen to them. So when we talk about access and functional needs, we're talking about that whole community perspective of who needs access and who needs support to meet their functional needs. So we're not just talking about people with disabilities. We're also talking about older adults, some of whom do have those legal protections, but don't own it. My parents, I don't have a disability. I'm just moving slower. I'm just having a hard time understanding what you're saying. I'm just having a hard time. Could you make the text a little larger on my screen? You know, we're talking about people who have temporary health conditions or chronic health conditions, but who don't talk about that as disability. We're talking about pregnant women. If a pregnant woman is in a shelter and that shelter doesn't have grab bars in the bathroom, or if we're expecting her to lie on a cot that's 9 inches off the floor, she has access and functional needs that if we don't meet them, she can't use the bathroom. She can't get a good night's rest. Where is she going to end up if our shelter hasn't planned for meeting access and functional needs? She's going to end up in the hospital. We don't need to be sending pregnant women to the hospital in the middle of a disaster. We need to be planning to meet the needs of every community who are going to have pregnant women showing up as part of our disaster response. People with limited English proficiency, people who are very poor. Several people talked yesterday about preparedness and the imperative that individuals have an opportunity to prepare. Well, we can say that people have that obligation, and I truly believe everybody needs to take personal preparedness seriously, and that we all have a responsibility. But if what you're telling me is I need to have 3 or 5 or 10 days of my medication, and I go to my local pharmacy and I say, I'm taking personal responsibility for my preparedness and I'd like an extra 3 or 5 or 10 days of my medication, and my pharmacy laughs at me, I'm not going to be able to purchase, and I take a lot of medication. I have lupus and I take a lot of medication that helps me to maintain my health, my safety, my independence. And some of my medications are shockingly expensive. I have a good job. I can't afford to pay out of pocket for those additional expenses. So if we expect people to take personal responsibility, we also need to get real about what that's going to take. Furthermore, I carry 2 weeks of my medication with me wherever I go. I have 2 weeks of my medication right over there in my bag. Well, if we had some catastrophic event right now, and I don't want to cast aspersions on the rest of you all, but if suddenly this side of the room was separated from that side of the room, my 2 weeks of medication is over there, I'm over here. I'm still going to have that same need. And if I can't maintain my medication, I'm going to get real sick real quick, and I'm going to end up in your emergency room. And I know that your local health system doesn't have the capacity to meet the needs of people who really don't need to be there, except for the fact that our planning needs have failed. So there are lots and lots of folks who have access and functional needs. I'm going to take another example. I'm also going to be mindful of the time. Local grocery store. So anybody here not use a grocery store on a fairly regular basis? Paul, because you have Kelly to do it for you. Okay. So when you get to the local grocery store, what do you see? Parking lot? No step entrance? Automatic doors? What else? Say that and I'll repeat it. All shelving. Oh, tall shelving. Thank you. I'll just throw them out there because I'm not going to be able to hear what you're saying. How about grocery carts? Okay. Those motorized grocery carts. Great, huh? What about those regular carts? Is that an accommodation? Ever gone in just for one or two things, and then suddenly there's something on sale that you really like? Now you have a functional need because you haven't gotten a cart. That cart provides universal accessibility to everybody. If you don't have that cart, you have a functional need that then needs to be met. The lighting in the grocery store, the signage in the grocery store meet a larger universal accessibility need. It reduces the number of people who are going to require functional assistance because most of us can navigate the grocery store because of those universal design items that are built in. So when you think about that in terms of emergency planning, the more we build in, the more we provide universal accessibility, the less we have to insert specific functional accommodations because most people are going to be able to get their needs met. Why does the grocery store do this? Because they're kind and benevolent and this is all about doing the right thing for the community? Now, this is a really smart business model. They'll even bring your groceries to your house these days, right? And what happens if you can't reach something, or because you have low vision or you're blind and you can't see the stuff that's on those shelves? Do they provide an accommodation? Sure they do. You can go and ask for assistance, and they will be more than happy, not always fast, but they will be more than happy. They have a plan for how to accommodate you. So access and functional needs is about providing access to as many people and as many scenarios as you can, and then having a plan to meet the functional needs of those folks who are not going to be accommodated using that universal design approach. You don't have to figure all this stuff out, though, in isolation, because in every community in this country, there are disability organizations that are run by and for people with disabilities who do this stuff on a daily basis and want to be at those planning tables. Lots of people will say, yeah, we keep inviting them and they keep not showing up. Well, yesterday, I know there were folks who were talking about, well, if that's the case, go out to where they are. Start getting involved in some of what they're involved in. All of this is about relationships. All of this is about sharing those resources. You don't have to figure it out for people. We have a saying in the disability community, I'm going to blast through here because we're just about out of time. We have a saying, nothing about us without us. And what that means is we want to be at the table. We want to be part of the planning, identifying what the issues are, the solutions, and Lots of people, rather than thinking about people with disabilities as a liability in emergencies and disasters, when we give people the opportunity to participate, can become an asset. I'm a master at problem solving because I'm a person with a disability. I have 2 kids with disabilities. I've been doing this stuff for a long time, so I'm really good at problem solving. So I'm an asset at your planning table, and there are lots of folks like me, not because I'm working in emergency management, but because I do this on a daily basis. There are lots of people in your community, and our regional disability integration specialists, part of their role is to help you to make those marriages between emergency management, public health, and disability groups. I'm going to buzz through really quickly on a couple of other things. We provide a lot of training to help you all sort of see what this looks like. We have a 2-hour online independent study course available for free, and it's accessible as is required and as it should be. Independent study, including people with disabilities and others with access and functional needs in disaster operations. If you want more information about how all this stuff works, that might be a good place to go. The Emergency Management Institute online, and we can provide that link to you through Paul and Holly. I'm buzzing through these really quickly. You know, we do many things in planning across alerts and warnings. Information has to be accessible to be actionable. Exercises can't use actors, have to use real people posing real world challenges if you want to adequately plan for success. Many evacuation issues, mass care. There's so much to be said in the area of mass care. Again, we plan for the whole community. We bring folks to the table who can help us to figure out what the issues are, and then we identify durable medical equipment, consumable medical supplies, cots, other things that are going to make it possible for everyone to be accommodated in that general population environment. Again, we're trying to keep people who don't have acute medical needs out of the acute healthcare system. It's good for everybody. Power issues, we have got to be planning for people who require an uninterrupted supply of power. And there are lots of great promising practices out there for how to do that. And we're happy to work with you and brainstorm with you and share those promising practices. Our disaster recovery centers, you know, FEMA doesn't do sheltering, but what we do are providing services in disaster recovery centers. And we provide physical program and effective communication access in those disaster recovery centers. Recovery. I'm going to wrap up by just taking a couple of minutes to talk about recovery. Anybody know how much money was spent or is in the process of being spent in New York after Hurricane Sandy? $30 billion. How about New Jersey? About the same. $30 billion. What are they spending it on? Infrastructure. Schools, hospitals, roads, transportation. When was the last time a community had the opportunity to invest in their infrastructure? Probably the last time they got a lot of money. And, you know, it's scalable. In Napa, after the recent earthquake, they got about $200 million, I believe, or in the process. We're talking about a lot of money. How many of those dollars have to comply with the Rehabilitation Act? All of them. If we use universal accessibility, not because we're required to by law, but because that's smart practice, the next time we build a school, we're going to build a school thinking not just about 9 to 3, K to 3rd grade, we're going to be thinking about that school as a potential shelter site, that everybody can have their needs met. We're going to plan for it. The next time we're investing in our transportation system, we're going to be thinking in terms of evacuation and how we invest in that transportation system so that everybody can get the heck out of Dodge, not just the, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. fixed route system. So lots of people talk about there's no money. This is very complicated. All of that's true. But if you all aren't talking about your next opportunity for disaster recovery and how you're going to build in the universal accessibility opportunities, you're going to be running after the train again. So housing obviously doesn't get a whole lot better after a disaster, so it should be no surprise. And one of the things that FEMA is doing, I know that people say there's no money, and I get it. But one of the things that FEMA can do, we can't tell your states how to spend their money. But what we have done is provide guidance on how to use those FEMA grants that your state is already getting to support inclusive, universal accessibility, inclusive design, planning for and with people with disabilities, people with access and functional needs. So when we do this right, this is not just about doing what the law requires of us. This is about really optimizing limited resources and benefiting the whole community. And there are people in your community on a daily basis who work on this stuff, figuring out how to bring folks to the same table, learning each other's language, figuring out how we're going to address physical access, program access, effective communication access. Steady state, it's going to make us far better prepared when we need to respond to, recover from, and mitigate the next disaster. So that's about it for me. I don't know if we have any time for any questions. We don't, because we're trying to get everybody out the door. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
We do have time.